Okay, good morning all. Hope you are still doing very well. I've had a bit of feedback about the booklet on the video and the fact that it's a little bit far away from the screen and you can't see it properly, so I've tried to fix that this lesson. If it's still a problem, email me and let me know. I'll try and do better next time. Let's have a look at where we are. Today's going to be a lot longer of a lesson. It's going to probably be less of me talking and more of you focused on the activities, however, so there's a lot for you to do, not so much for me to explain here. Again, let's just have a quick recap of where we are. So we started this unit of work looking at the alliance system, looking at how German actions might have pushed together some of the greatest rivals that Germany had, the French and the Russians. We saw how Bismarck, trying to maintain the status quo, was completely undermined by Wilhelm II. As we move forward, that status quo is upset. Germany is in a situation it does not want to be. It also has this foreign policy of Weltpolitik, this idea that actually Germany wants to do more. Germany wants its place in the sun, and that's led a lot by the military, but also the chancellorship of Bülow and Bethmann can be seen as contributors to that aggressive foreign policy. Again, we see evidence of all of this manifesting now. We see the Schlieffen Plan when we come to our militarization lesson. And all of these different aspects of our coursework so far have really been about German aggression. So was Germany responsible for the outbreak of the First World War? Here's what Germany have done. Now, this lesson is still has a large focus of German responsibility, as you can see in the learning objective, but it's also about international relations. Now that means we're going to have to look at the role of people like France, Russia, Britain, and we're going to have to say, okay, well, Germany shares some responsibility. Germany aren't the only ones that fight a war. They can't share all of the responsibility. Where do we see the nuance of this argument lying? Some of you have emailed me of some arguments that have been really, really good, and it's been really nice to see that you're looking at the individuals within Germany as well. So, perhaps there's a divide within society and the hierarchy. Perhaps there's a divide between the military and the government. And all of these different aspects are really going to shape your argument. This is going to go even further, and this is going to now throw in the roles of other nations. Now, we started to see that last lesson with Britain. Okay, yes, Britain were already the forerunners of the naval game. They already had the best navy, possibly the best military. However, do they share some responsibility for being an intimidating nation, making nations feel like Germany, a young new nation looking to expand its power, quite weary and therefore quite confrontational? What we're going to do today is we're going to start to look, and I'm just going to go through the lesson objective again. We're going to assess the significance of the main events of the build-up to the war using the view of historians to determine the level of German responsibility for outbreak of the war. It's a very long lesson objective. That's why I've cut it into two here. So first job, we're going to assess the significance of the main events in the build-up to the war. We're now going to see closer. So a lot of our stuff has been, or a lot of the facts we've looked at haven't been as close to the war as we might need to form a judgment here. Today we're going to go up to, I think the latest date is 1912 or possibly 1913. And we're going to see the very immediate kind of beginnings of the First World War. After we've looked at the significance of those events, so we've decided, okay, how far do they contribute to war? How much do they look like war's going to be a problem? We're then going to use the view of historians to determine how much Germany are responsible. So after we've had a look at all these events, we're going to use historians' work to platform our view here, our argument. Now remember, this is going to be, and I've said this before, you need to be in reading mode. This is all about, as historians, being able to look at the work of other people, that word again, historiography, that Dr. Longston will go through, and build your argument on top of that. Now, our first step to doing that is to actually identify those main events and identify the significance. Now, over the last couple of years, this lesson's changed quite a bit, and we've tried to make it as accessible as we possibly can. So what I want you to do now is just get your booklets in front of you. And I've already kind of had a go at this. We're going to have a look at those events, and we're going to do exactly what it says. So, rising international tensions. Let's have a look at the significance of those events leading up to the First World War. Now, as you can see in your booklet, you've got kind of 5 different stimulus points that we could, or 5 different ways to categorize each of these events. So these are the different viewpoints here. First, Europe slowly fell into war. No country had a deliberate policy of seeking war. Now, this is very much a kind of I don't know how to explain this one. This is a bit of a kind of chaos theory, if you like. This is all about Europe just settling into a war. No one's actively pursuing it, no one wants a war, but the conditions of Europe mean that war is inevitable. Second, Germany pursued an aggressive foreign policy and aimed at fighting a European war to achieve power. Now, if we were to look at something like that, that might be elements of Weltpolitik. But the main point here is that they are looking, their policy is aimed towards fighting a European war. So we might see something aggressive, but we might not decide that that's aimed at fighting a European war. So you have to use that one quite sparingly. Number 3, Germany reacted to the European diplomatic situation, which saw Germany encircled by the Triple Entente. This is all going to be about your alliances. So the way that Germany has been kind of, pushed to one side. You might still say that Germany are responsible for that, but at the same time, they're also going to react to it. Germany did not plan a European war, but they did pursue a foreign policy that sought to expand Germany's wider influence. Now, this again could be of Weltpolitik in action, but again, the key difference here, the key nuance, one of them is asking about Germany looking for a war, the other one is asking for Germany about expanding its power. So it involved diplomatic risks. Now that is going to be a really important phrase, not just for this lesson, but later lessons as well. And then finally, aggressive nationalism and war was seen as an opportunity to divert attention away from domestic issues. We've seen this argument before, and unite the nation around a patriotic cause. So again, this kind of outwards looking Germany. If we distract people away from this country's tensions, have a look at foreign tensions or foreign investments, we can kind of rally the nation behind a singular cause. There is a modern day analogy. I'm not sure I'm allowed to make it, but I'm sure you can work out what I'm trying to get at here, of a nation that is not dealing with its social issues and instead is pushing people to look at issues outside of the nation. I'm not going to go any further with that, but I'm sure you can work out what I'm trying to get at here. This is a tactic that's used all the time by all nations, even up to the modern day. Okay, let's move on. Let's have a look at what this evidence is. Again, I'm not going to do all this for you, not the point of these videos. It's just to facilitate the tasks and make sure that you know what you're doing. Let's have a look at what we've got here. So if you in fact you might want to pause so that you can get your color code in there, and then we'll crack on. So our evidence. Now usually this analysis is left blank. We've kind of put it there for you now to make it a little bit more accessible, and it allows you to access some of the high level thinking as we go throughout this lesson. So, first Moroccan crisis of 1905 and 1906. We looked at this a little bit last week, and we're going to continue to develop on what we know and how that feeds into our argument. So Morocco was an accepted part of the French sphere of influence. Now, I'm not going to highlight anything, but I'm going to circle that this is the French sphere of influence because we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at France later on. Britain had agreed to support France in her interests in Morocco. In 1905, the Kaiser landed in Tangiers and made a dramatic speech in Morocco, in which he assured the Sultan that Germany fully supported Moroccan independence, shocking many in Europe. Germany wanted to humiliate France and hoped that the incident would damage Anglo-French relations by revealing the flimsy nature of British support for her French ally. There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of different arguments that we could say are existing. First of all, this is quite clearly a diplomatic risk. This is quite clearly looking to expand Germany's wider influence. Germany do not have control over Morocco. The French do. So the fact that the Germans or the Kaiser is even making himself known or kind of making this dramatic speech, this is a diplomatic risk. Assures the Sultan that Germany fully supported Moroccan independence. Now that eventually could lead to war. That eventually could be a war of independence in which the Germans have given their support to the Moroccans. We don't know yet. What we can't say is that this is policy aimed at fighting a European war. We can't say that this is policy where the Kaiser has said, we want war, we're going to actively sort it. This is a diplomatic risk. They are risking that eventuality to expand their wider influence. But there's another factor at play here. Not only are they expanding their influence, but they're also responding to the encirclement that they're under. Have a look here. Germany wanted to humiliate France and hoped that the incident would damage Anglo-French relations. This is quite clearly a response to the Entente Agreement. This is quite clearly a response to France and Britain, two major powers, leaving Germany feeling like they're slightly isolated. So let's have a look at what that significance is now. Let's have a look at the analysis of this event. The British saw the Kaiser's actions as a clear example of Germany's dangerous imperial ambitions. Okay, so again, this is all about now this wider influence of Germany. The 1906 conference helped to resolve the Morocco crisis at Algeciras. It ended in German humiliation. France, Britain, Russia, and even Germany's ally Italy recognised French influence in Morocco. Now, all that's going to do, that's going to strengthen what exists. Germany was diplomatically isolated. Again, in fighting that isolation, Germany have kind of made it worse here. France confirmed its control over Morocco, and the Anglo-French relations were strengthened. Some of you might not know this, but Britain's historic rival throughout history, the biggest rival that Britain has to its power, has always been the French. This is, I'd argue, the first time that actually the tables have turned and that the French and the British are now, quite strong allies with one another. Many British leaders were convinced Germany was both a threat to European stability and the empire. So no mention here that Germany are seeking war, but they are definitely undermining the stability of both the European status quo and also empires of these nations. Now, as we go down, so again, evidence, analysis. What happens, why it's important, why it might lead to war. This is what we need to be aware of here, because this is going to help our argument later on. What I want you to do is I want you to go through the rest. Now, there are quite a number of events here. So we've got the Triple Entente, Bosnian crisis, escalation of naval rivalry. You've already got some knowledge on that. Second Moroccan crisis, as if one wasn't enough. War Council meeting in 1912, and the Balkan Wars. Have a read through. Identify for me which of these colours you're going to use. And again, this is all about, and this is why I maybe haven't said this, and maybe I should have, have some notes alongside your booklet. Make some notes about where your arguments are fitting in here, because all of this stuff here, all of this analysis on this side, this is really going to help you form your argument, and it's really going to help you answer that learning objective. Who is responsible? How much responsibility does Germany have? How can we create a wider, kind of more complete picture of this, of how this battle, or how this great war comes to exist? Pause it here. Have a go at that. Once you've done that, we will come back and I'll tell you what you're going to do next. Again, it's going to be less of me talking, more of you doing. Right, see you in a second. Right, okay, so hopefully, I have to zoom out again here. Hopefully you've got that done. And what I can do now is explain the second activity to you. And what's going to happen here, I'm sure many of you can work it out without me telling you, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. We've got our timeline of events. So if we look back at our objectives here, we've already identified the significance of these main events. What we need to do now is kind of look at where the importance of those developments lie. And this is really important because this is going to allow you to identify possibly a turning point. It's going to allow you to identify maybe where you see the tides turning in terms of war beginning. It might even give you an idea of how the different events contribute to one another. Now, all you're going to do here is really straightforward. You are going to use your events and you are going to place them on this timeline. Now, remember, it's not just going in order of date, but also in order of how intense or how likely this is to break out into war. So we've got all the way from calm to tense to breaking point. Now again, I'm going to give you one example and then I'm going to leave it up to you, and let's have a look at the, what should we go for here? In fact, let's go for what we started with here, the first Moroccan crisis. Now, for something to be considered calm, what we would expect here is something that does not look like it's going to contribute to war, something that isn't really going to upset the balance of power, something that really does very little in the kind of progression towards war. As we go up, obviously that's going to increase until we get to tense. Now, tense is going to be one of those events that actually does upset the balance of things and does, potentially contribute, maybe not directly lead, but contribute to the First World War. And then breaking point, the moment where war seems inevitable. We are not going to avoid this war. This is, it's either war or a miracle at this point. Now, obviously, we're going to have varying degrees of where we see our events leading. And if we start with 1905 and we start with that first Moroccan crisis, well, let's have a look at what it says. A threat to European stability, okay, quite clearly not calm. Germany becomes diplomatically isolated, okay, maybe not as dangerous as Germany once was, but it did have dangerous imperial ambitions. Strengthened ties between the French and the English, which Germany are already unhappy with. So what I might do here is, I'm definitely not saying this is calm. This is a diplomatic disaster for Germany, but it's also a real kind of a red flag for Britain and France. They are concerned about Germany now. So this causes them, for me, and you might disagree here, but I'm going to say that this leads to quite a lot of tension. I wouldn't say it's breaking point, but I'd say it's about here. So this pen's not going to be very good, so I'm just going to put MC1. You're not going to do that. You're going to actually write this down. So Moroccan Crisis 1. And what I might then do is I might then just kind of bullet point why I think this is raising tensions. So I'm going to say here, well, first of all, it is a red flag to Britain and France as German imperial ambitions are used to directly challenge established powers. Now, that's not going to be the only point I make. I might also make the point that the isolation that Germany were now so worried about has become 10 times worse. But you're getting the gist of this. All I'm doing is marking these points on my timeline. And what you should be able to do is start to work out where the turning point is, where war seems most likely to break out. The beauty of this video is that I don't have 20 students saying to me, "Sir, I can't read your handwriting. Can you read it out for me?" Go back, replay it if you can't read it. I'm sorry, my handwriting's not great. It's even worse on this computer. So I'm going to leave that there. Use all of these events, and I want you to put it into the timeline. Again, try and keep a set of notes alongside you to help you form your argument here, because it's really going to help you when it comes to writing your coursework. Give the video a pause, see where you think the breaking point is, and we'll come back, and what we'll do is we will start to assess and come up with our argument and compare that with the argument of historians as well. So give it a pause and I'll talk to you in a moment. Okay, now at this point we've identified, we've looked at the significance of these events. What I now want you to do is produce a little bit of an analysis to show the extent of international tensions by 1914. And it's all those questions we've spoken about before. Did war seem imminent? Where was war most likely to break out? Which places appeared to be international fault lines? Now that phrase exists when talking about the Balkan Wars and the Bosnian crisis. Which countries had behaved most peacefully and aggressively? What was a stake for the countries involved? Would this make war more or less likely? What I want you to do is basically, based on that evidence, provide a conclusion now. Number one, who is responsible? Number two, which events look like they were to contribute to war the most? Number three, all of these points kind of included here. Now, it's going to be hard for me to, a bit like all of our writing this unit of work, it's going to be really hard for me to model this for you, because you're all going to come out of this with different opinions. And again, if we're in a classroom right now, what I would love is to have, people telling me, no, actually, the War Council shows that Germany are the main aggressors. They've got the Schlieffen Plan backed up. They're going to use that. Someone else shouting across the room to me, the Bosnian crisis is the most important. Actually, no, the Moroccan crisis. We don't have that, which means it's going to kind of solely rely on where you believe your argument is. Thankfully, I've had people emailing me their arguments, asking me, is this a legitimate thing to say? Is this historically accurate, valid? And I've been able to reply to those people. So please, if you're worried about any of this, do send that email, and I'm happy to, look at your argument and tell you what I think of that. Have a look at these points, and I want you to now decide what is the extent of international tensions. Is by 1914, is war imminent? Where is war most likely to happen? So, geographically speaking, where is war most likely to take place? Which places are the international fault lines? It links into this one. Which countries are behaving the most peacefully and aggressively? So not only, where is this war likely to happen, but who is most responsible for this war? And what was the stake for the countries involved? What does Russia gain from a war? What does Austria gain from a war? What does Serbia gain from a world war? Obviously, I didn't know it'd be a world war, but what can they gain from this? What I would recommend is reading through the evidence points again before you actually answer this question, because as you will go through, you'll start to see that actually there are a number of different countries that are involved by the end of this, by 1913. There are a number of different countries that have a that have something to gain as a result of a war, or perhaps have something to lose. So go through, have a go at telling me. I'm not going to give you the answers because I think it defeats the point of these videos. They're not there for me to give you the answers. They're there for me to help you find your own answers. If you are questioning what you've put, please email me. I've responded to a number of emails. I'm happy to respond to many more. Have a go, and we'll come back afterwards and we'll see what our arguments are. Right, so hopefully by this stage we've kind of we've done this. We've identified the significance of those main events. Number two, we've compared the importance of these developments. We've explained why each event is likely to lead to war, and we've now kind of got an idea of what our argument is here. How can we explain the extent of tensions in 1914? Is it a breaking point, etc.? Who is responsible? Now, you've done that in your conclusion. Please feel free to email me that so that I can have a look if you're unsure. Now what we need to do is that final point of our lesson objective here, and it is to draw conclusions about the extent of German culpability. So again, looking at this through the lens of Germany, for the outbreak of the war, incorporating the views of historians. Now, before we do that, what I would like to do, because I feel like what we've done is we've kind of put a lot of the blame on Germany and not really explained or looked at the role of other nations. Now, if we look at the last box here, the Balkan Wars, Serbia, a confident state, ready for a second round against Austria. Austria felt threatened by Serbia's growing strength and issued Serbia an ultimatum. Now, all of this is about a conflict that is outside of Germany's control. All of this is about a conflict that actually Germany aren't in charge of. What should start, the arguments that should be starting to form, and that maybe you got in your last activity here, is that yes, Germany have made mistakes, and of course Germany have been aggressive, they've made diplomatic risks. However, as we get closer to the war, the theatre of war isn't on German soil, it isn't on French soil, isn't in Britain, isn't on Russian soil. It's actually in the Balkans. It's this conflict between Serbia and Austria where things might start to get complicated. Because look, Germany have to give their full support to Austria because they're allies. They're the only, one of the only allies Germany have. So hopefully what's starting to be seen is that Germany have contributed to this situation, but the immediate kind of foreshadowing of this war isn't in Germany's hands. It's outside of Germany. What you then can, of course, say is that the Kaiser declares, "I'm happy to draw the sword whenever your move makes it necessary." The Kaiser isn't backing down here. He's making it very clear that he will support Austria in this battle. Doesn't really result in anything in the end. But this is a really dangerous pretext for what might happen later on. And some of you that already know what does happen will know that this is almost, if you do English, this is like the perfect example of foreshadowing of a major event. So please do bear that in mind, because now we're starting to move away from Germany by looking at other factors, but still kind of using that as our focal point here. Now, one historian, Christopher Clark, starts to talk about the importance of the Franco-Russian alliance. So we know that this agreement between the two nations is one that encircles Germany. Let's have a look through what he says. I'm only going to pick out bits and pieces here. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I'm going to tell you what you're going to do for your kind of last activity here of this lesson. So the importance of the Franco-Russian alliance. So it says here that the Franco-Russian alliance has constructed a geopolitical trigger along the Austro-Serbian frontier. So this is less about encircling Germany. This is more about what's going on in that Balkan crisis, or, in that Balkan region. They're tied the defence policy of three of the world's greatest powers to uncertain fortunes of Europe's most violent and unstable region. For France, the commitment to the Serbian salient was a logical consequence of the commitment to the Franco-Russian alliance, which was in itself a consequence of what French policymakers saw as an immovable policy constraints. What this is basically telling us is that the French now have a hand in this Austro-Serbian frontier, and it's because of that alliance they have with the Russians. So because the Russians support the Serbs, the French, by the rules of the alliance, have to then also support the Serbs. If the Russians are embroiled in a war, so must the French in their defence. France was thus obliged to seek a means of compensating in the east for the security deficits in the west, as the Belgian minister had put it in the spring of 1913. The less solid and effective British friendship seemed, the more French strategists felt the need to tighten the bonds of their alliance with Russia. So the French felt like they couldn't rely on Britain too much. And actually what's interesting is that looking back on the First World War, Britain actually could have avoided that war. And they could have done so very easily if it wasn't for... And actually, I'm saying this as if it's historical fact. This is more my historical opinion here. Britain could have avoided that war, and they could have done so relatively easy if it wasn't for their own imperial ambition. Now, that might be something worth thinking about as you move forward. So the French realise this. The French say to themselves, well, actually, Britain don't need this. Or any conflict that might happen, Britain doesn't really need to be a part of. So they're not going to have our back as much as the Russians. Hence, the French feel like they're obliged to help Russia. Increasingly, intimate military relationships were reinforced by the application of powerful financial incentives. We need to draw an important distinction. At no point did the French or the Russian strategists involve a plan to launch a war of aggression against the Central Powers. So Russia and France, they were never planning to go to war. We are dealing here with scenarios, no plans as such, but it's striking nonetheless how little thought the policy makers gave the effect that their actions were likely to have on Germany. Now let's think about this. A Balkan crisis, a situation where Serbia has the backing of Russia and therefore France. Now who are the Serbians in conflict with? Well, it's the Austrians. The only ally, or the only strengthened ally at this point, the Germans have. This isn't considered by the French and the Russians. And so even though yes, I'm going to scroll back up here, even though yes, the quote, "I'm prepared to draw the sword whenever you make your move makes it necessary," that is one of challenge, but it could also be a response to the fact that the Germans see the French and the Russians undermining their only ally. Since they viewed their own actions as entirely defensive and ascribed aggressive intentions solely to the enemy obviously being Germany, the key policymakers never took seriously the possibility that the measures they were themselves enacting might be narrowing the options available to Berlin. Again, exactly what I've said here. What are Berlin going to do, or what are the Germans going to do, if they see their only ally undermined by two of the continent's biggest powers? Of course they're going to give their support, because if they lose that ally, who have they then got? It was a striking example of what international relations theorists called a security dilemma, in which the steps taken by one to enhance its security render the others more insecure and compel them to prepare for the worst. What should be coming very clear to you is that this is confusing. There's a lot going on here, and it isn't just because some of you, and I know that some of you have said this because you've emailed me, some of you said, Germany just being, they're being unfair about this. What are they doing? They're going to Morocco. Who do they think they are? A little bit more complicated now. This is a web of different factors. This is a web of different, everything we've looked at, alliances, militarization, Weltpolitik, and now international relations, all feed into one another. It isn't that one factor is the key reason for the war. So, what we've got here is kind of a summary of the argument. I'm not going to go through that, so I've just read the whole argument with you. But what you need to do now is you need to find the factual examples from this lesson that you think support this analysis. Now, that can start, even though this is talking about 1914, I think this can start as early as 1905 to help back up this claim that actually the Franco-Russian agreement, as Christopher Clark is saying here, is where the French see Germany as a huge threat and they nullify this threat. Now, as you go through, and again, it's going to be all the evidence from up here, try and find the evidence that you think best explains or best supports this historian's argument. So straight away, I'm going to talk about the Balkan crisis, the Balkan Wars. Straight away, I'm going to mention that the French give their support to the Russians. Straight away, I'm going to mention that entente mean that that's something that's unbreakable. That's definitely something I'm going to mention. If I go back up, I might also possibly talk about the Second Moroccan crisis as well. The fact that Germany are, the foreshadowing to this is that Germany have already made themselves clear that they are willing to take diplomatic risks to undermine the French. How are the French going to respond? What you've then got is you've got a kind of selection of questions here. So right here, it's got, could it be argued that German aggression between 1905 and 1911 caused this? Again, this is building on what you would have said already here in terms of your factual evidence. So how much blame does Germany actually have in the French giving such wide-scale support to the Russians? And does Clark ignore that a little bit in what he's saying? Again, you're reading this historian quite critically. So if I was to go back and I was to look at what Clark is saying, and I was to say, yep, okay, fine. The French did ascribe aggressive intentions to the enemy. That's something they definitely did. However, the enemy had shown themselves to be aggressive. They'd done that on numerous occasions. And, the fact that there are two Moroccan crises show that this is not something that is isolated. These are events that are going to continue happening. They send a warship. They send a warship to Morocco. That is a sign of aggression. What else can the French do? So try and think about here, and this is like the crux of what you're doing in your coursework. How can you challenge this? How can Germany share some responsibility? And then finally, factual examples to challenge Clark and argue that actually the strengthening of this Franco-Prussian alliance was a logical consequence of German foreign policy. Again, what you should start to see is that these all build on one another. This is basically the stepping stones of forming an argument against this. Now, as you go through, you're going to see that there are a number of different questions or points that you need to raise in order to answer or look at these arguments critically. So I've got one about the Balkans here, second one here. Now, what this does is this is essentially you looking at these arguments critically. So when it's asking you to challenge key terms and their definitions, have a look at what the historian is saying. So for instance, if this historian is saying that, I'm trying to find a good example here. Give me a look. So, Balkan Wars recalibrated the relationships among the greater or lesser powers in dangerous ways. You might think about that and say, okay, well, if we're recalibrating relationships, that means that they have fallen off and they needed a kind of greater coming together. It means that possibly the French and Russians weren't in so much support of one another, but this Balkan War situation has pushed them together. It might be that, the conflict that exists between the Entente and the Axis wasn't so prominent, but now has been. Challenge that. See if you can, do you agree with it? Do you think that actually there's evidence to suggest this isn't quite true? Summarise what the argument is actually saying. What is this historian actually saying about the Balkan Wars? Again, those key phrases are going to be really important in understanding what this historian is saying. Having marked your section C, one thing that a few of us are doing that isn't quite where it needs to be, we're misreading the argument. One way to help do that, read the key terms, have a look at what they're saying, challenge some of the things they're saying, and that's going to be able to allow you to summarise their argument. And then once you've summarised that argument, go even further. Summarise it into a single sentence or a headline. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to basically reach that final lesson objective here. That is going to allow you to draw those conclusions. Now, one thing I would recommend after you've done this is going to be the last activity of the lesson. One thing I really would recommend is after you've had a look at these arguments, go back to yours. Go back to what you have said about the extent of international tension by 1914. see if there's actually a way that you could amend this. Have you looked at historians' work that's challenged what you said and therefore want to change parts of your argument? I think it's really important that you're getting to grips now with what historians are saying, how to challenge what historians are saying, and how to also challenge yourself with those arguments, because that is going to be the core part of your coursework in the end. That's basically it in terms of what I need to tell you. Just to recap then, we've had a look at the significance of these events. We've had a look at how they might lead to eventual war. We've had a look at where, and this will be completed for you, where your breaking points are, where there's the greatest amount of tension. Then you formed your argument. Okay, what is the extent of international tension? Where is war going to happen? Why is war going to happen? Who's the aggressor? And then you've had a look at some historian arguments here, and what I'm hoping is that those historian arguments have allowed you to critically look at your own opinion. Please do keep emailing me with your arguments. It's really helpful for me to know where your thinking's at. So far it's been fantastic, so thank you for those emails, and let me know if you're still struggling to actually read what's on the booklet here. Right, enjoy, keep working hard, and I will not be sending you out a lesson on Tuesday, because on Tuesday you will be using that time to respond to your feedback for your Germany papers. So don't worry about expecting a video on that Tuesday double lesson. I want you to be responding to the feedback you've got from your Germany papers. And again, any questions about that, feel free to email myself or Mr. Hinchcliffe, dependent on who your teacher is. Right, I'm sick of my own voice. You're probably really sick of it, so I'm going to let you get on with that. Thank you very much, Year 12, and I will see you next time.